Today, we will be taking a look at the role of women within Mexican history, mainly from 1940 to the present. I do want to briefly touch on the history of women in Mexico before 1940. I believe that it is extremely important to understand to what extent women's roles were before 1940. The women of the past are so important to understanding the causes that the women stood for in the present and possibly the future. Mayan women were limited within the responsibilities and rights compared to their male counterparts. Aztec women were distinctly their own group, and at times had equality in many aspects that their male counterparts did. The time of the Spanish conquest, when it came to women, they were seen as property and were sold to the Spanish because they were viewed as something to be given away or bargained with. During the Spanish era, there was a societal hierarchy that was starting to be seen within the female community. Between the years of 1810 and 1850, some women fought in the War of Independence, and they also started to realize that they wanted more citizenship rights. Then, between 1850 and 1939, women started advocating heavily for those rights, and women participated in the revolution. Now, when we're looking at women from 1940 to the present, we need to ask ourselves, why were these women important to Mexican history? Now, in 2017, women made up about half of the population of Mexico, but they did not have the rights that men did, even though they made up half of that population. During the time frame of the 1940s to the present, women were making great strides in Mexico. To some extent, this will be in the form of getting a right to vote, becoming part of higher government, and working against gender violence. Without the contributions of these women, Mexico's history and current state would not be as rich or fulfilling. As can be seen here with a picture of Claudia Pardaro, she is a Mexican politician, a scientist, and she also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for her work on climate change on an international scale. We will take a look at some of these important moments for women within Mexican history. Women's rights to vote was implemented in 1953. It was approved some 30 years before, but it was never implemented until that moment. In 1968, the Mexico 68 started a feminist movement that caught fire and set the stage for other feminist movements to occur later on. In 1976, the Coalition de Mujeres was a group of women who were looking to change laws about abortion, rape, and violence. And this is a huge topic within the history of Mexico for women, and we will be taking a closer look at that later on in the presentation. And then in 1997, women in Mexico realized that they are dependent on their spouses or the men in their lives, which leads to a higher ratio of abuse. The start on this note is not that it was necessarily an important movement, but it is an important moment for women because it is noted that there is a higher rate of abuse towards women in Mexico than in the bordering countries. So, we can take a look at this map. It is from 2013. It shows the gender gap index for the world, as can be seen in Mexico. There is quite the significant gender gap. You can see right here, quite a significant gender gap within the whole country. It's the same as what we're seeing in Chile, okay, and India, and China, and Russia, Indonesia, Brazil. So we're seeing a significant gender gap in countries that obviously have issues with gender inequality. So it is very important to note kind of where they are on a global scale. I believe that this is also necessary to look at this map because it is showing that Mexico kind of does blend into the background, is not necessarily noticed on a global scale when it comes to inequality. At least it's something that is not necessarily thought of as much as the other countries that were previously listed. Now, who is to blame? When we look at those important moments for women and the global index scale for gender gap, we really need to ask ourselves, who is to blame for this inequality between women and men in Mexico? And there are three different groups that are to blame. The politicians. Many times women are overlooked for positions in government. Laws aren't updated to have equality within education, healthcare, etc. And until the 1930s, there wasn't even a platform for women to be able to speak about their gender issues on a political scale. The second would be men. Mexico has one of the highest rates of violence against women in the world, much of this from their families or from their spouses. Again, it's that societal norm of how men believe that they should be acting and treating and where those women should be in the hierarchy. And again, societal norms. Gender inequalities have been impacted by the societal structures and Mexican culture expectations. This is why it's so important to look back at issues that were happening decades or centuries ago, because many of these issues are still occurring in some form because of those societal norms that are occurring within Mexico. We've talked about all these issues that women are facing, gender gap, inequalities, and exactly who was to blame for those things and what issues have come to light over the years. Now it is time to look at what Mexico is doing to address those issues that the women have been having. One is that in 1953, obviously, women were able to get the right to vote. That was instated at that time. The second would be in 2018, President Obrador appointed an equal number of women and men to his cabinet when he was elected as president. 3 is in 2019, he also signed into law protection and benefits for people that were domestic workers, which obviously is a majority of women in Mexico. In 1973, a family planning program was made to help with contraception. Many women have had a hard time in Mexico getting heard for family planning and the use of contraception, even within their own marriages. So this would be a huge game changer for Mexico and the women within the country. In 1989, the Center for Research and Action for Women helped start programs for Indigenous women in the Chiapas. Indigenous women is its own subgrouping within women in Mexico, and they face sometimes even greater inequalities than other women do. And in 2005, Mexico's Supreme Court declared marital rape illegal. This was something that was happening quite often within the Mexican culture, and finally in 2005, they were able to put a stop to kind of looking the other way with that and making that illegal. Now, some concluding thoughts and ideas is that the history of women in Mexico can teach us about how far they have come, but still how far they have to go. There's still much oppression and inequality within Mexico to this day. Their voices are still not being heard in political arenas and in policies. I believe that women in Mexico are being held back mainly by the men that are there to protect them from their lack of reproductive rights and educational rights. Those two things will, if they do not receive their reproductive rights and their educational rights, and they are continuing to be oppressed, I do not think that they will be able to make much progress in the future with education and a say within their reproductive rights. I believe that their voices will grow louder and their freedoms and equality will grow as well.